the pond metaphor, Buddhist wisdom to stop fighting your own mind. The persistent weight of your anxiety is what brought your awareness to this quiet space tonight, wasn't it? That familiar, suffocating tightness resting heavily upon your chest, those restless, geometric thoughts that refuse to stop spinning their frantic circles within your head. Understand the depth of that exhaustion completely. But you are entirely safe within this room now, protected from the relentless demands of the outer world. Allow your physical body to settle deeply into the immediate matrix of comfort surrounding you. Take a slow moment to turn down the brightness of the lights in your space, letting the shadows lengthen and soften. If you appreciate a steady, rhythmic background frequency, switch on a cooling fan to let its gentle hum soothe your ears. Gather an extra pillow to cradle your form, ensuring every muscle feels supported. This window of time belongs entirely and unconditionally to your spirit. Over the next few hours, a profound transformation is going to unfold within your consciousness. This shift will not take place because you are working hard, practicing intensely, or trying to execute a spiritual technique correctly, but rather because you are finally granting yourself the permission to stop striving. The ancient masters discovered an extraordinary secret centuries ago. True peace is not a hidden treasure you must aggressively hunt down. It is simply the original reality that remains when you completely abandon the search. Tonight, I am going to share 15 unique journeys of wisdom with you. Think of these simple narratives as a gentle, restorative medicine engineered specifically to heal modern exhaustion, to quiet the 3 o'clock morning wake-up alerts, to soothe the anxieties of tomorrow that attempt to hijack your rest tonight, and to completely dissolve that heavy, persistent illusion that you are somehow not enough. Already, the subtle rhythm of your breathing is beginning to expand. Your physical form naturally remembers the peace that your analytical intellect temporarily forgot. True stillness lives directly within the deep memory of your cells, patiently waiting. Let us step together into this immersive journey toward an absolute quietude, the hidden reservoir of the high valley. Let us first consider a pristine, undisturbed reservoir of water that exists directly within the center of your consciousness. You might not even realize it is present, obscured as it has been for years beneath layers of daily mental static, but it has been waiting in perfect tranquility since the days of your early childhood, perhaps even before you first learned that stillness was something you could lose to the world. Long ago, in a secluded valley where the morning mist rose like a slow breath from the earth, there was a small, unpretentious pool. It was neither grand nor famous. No travelers journeyed across oceans just to stand at its edge or document its dimensions. It was simply a quiet circle of water nestled securely among smooth, gray stones that had been softened and rounded by the patient passage of countless seasons. The surrounding trees leaned over its boundaries protectively, their interbalancing branches forming a majestic green canopy of wild cedar and ancient pine. Occasionally, these trees would drop their needles to float silently upon the surface before they drifted gracefully down into the dark, cold depths. This pool possessed an extraordinary characteristic. Whenever the ambient air grew completely calm, its surface stabilized into such an absolute mirror that it seemed to hold the entire sky within its embrace. It did not merely reflect the heavens, it accommodated them, giving the clouds and stars a second home. By day, white formations drifted across its depths, and by night the vast constellations appeared within its dark waters. The moon visited frequently, tracing silver paths across the surface that remained until the break of dawn. The local villagers understood the nature of this water. On quiet mornings, they would walk the forest path just to sit silently at its edge. They did not come to speak, to deliberate, or to engage in formal prayers, but to remember a core truth that the friction of daily life continuously caused them to forget. They would sit quietly and observe their own features appearing clearly in the water. Within that unmoving reflection, they would occasionally catch a glimpse of who they were before the world taught them to hurry. One evening, as the sky painted itself in deep shades of violet and amber, a weary traveler arrived at the basin. His footwear was caked with the dust of many roads, and his shoulders carried the physical weight of long miles and the even heavier burden of an overactive mind. You know this exact weight. It is the same companion that sits with you when you lie down at night, and your thoughts refuse to stop replaying old conversations. It is the anxiety that arrives when tomorrow's obligations line up like a demanding army, or when yesterday's perceived missteps echo louder than the grace of the present moment. The traveler had heard faint rumors of this water. He had been told it could reveal a self that existed beyond his daily stressed countenance, offering the very peace that his extensive travels had failed to secure. He sat down heavily by the edge, his joints protesting with the strain of his long journey, and peered into the water. What he saw startled him. His own face appeared in the dimming light, but it was heavily distorted. The lines of worry were etched deeper than he remembered, and his eyes appeared restless, shifting even within the water. Just then, a sudden breeze swept through the valley, stirring the surface into chaotic motion. His reflection broke instantly into 1,000 fragmented pieces. The traveler looked down upon the broken water and whispered into the night that he looked every bit as shattered as he felt inside. This is where you find yourself sometimes, isn't it? You look at the landscape of your life and perceive only fragments, unconnected pieces that do not seem to fit into a meaningful whole. You see a countenance in the mirror that looks deeply fatigued even after a night of sleep, and eyes that have simply forgotten how to soften their gaze. An elderly guide appeared from the shadows of the trees, moving with such absolute quietude that he might have been woven from the evening mist itself. His robes were simple, holding the muted color of rain clouds, and his footsteps barely disturbed the fallen pine needles beneath him. Without a word of invitation or a sense of hurry, he sat down directly beside the traveler. Together, they watched the agitated water. Slowly, the ripples began to lose their force, and the broken reflection began to gather itself back into a unified image. Finally, the guide spoke, his voice carrying the gentle texture of wind moving through dry leaves, asking the traveler what it was that he saw in the water. The traveler replied that he saw nothing but absolute chaos. He described a mind that never finds rest, a thoughtscape that is constantly churning, and exactly why he cannot sleep, why he cannot find true rest, and why the concept of internal peace feels like a beautiful fairy tale told only to comfort children. The guide nodded with infinite gentleness, the kind of validating nod that communicates absolute understanding without needing to rely on dense explanations. The guide explained that the water can only reflect reality clearly when it is allowed to become still, and that the exact same law applies to the human mind. He urged the traveler to observe a crucial truth, that we cannot command the wind to stop blowing through the valley. The practice of inner peace is never about controlling the storm. It is simply about watching the surface ripples with an unconditional kindness and allowing them to settle on their own. They always return to equilibrium if we stop stirring the water. Right now, in this very moment, your analytical mind might be generating its own internal wind. Perhaps it is whispering anxiously about an email you forgot to address, replaying an awkward social interaction from the past week for the 100th time, fast-forwarding to a high-pressure presentation, or rewinding to a conversation where you wish you had spoken differently. That is completely fine. That is simply what human minds do. They function exactly like weather systems, constantly in motion, continuously shifting their forms. The traveler closed his eyes, and initially, his intellect rebelled against the stillness. His thoughts argued that sitting silently by a basin of water would not resolve his financial obligations or untangle his life's complexities. But beneath that aggressive commentary, a deeper layer of awareness began to stir. It was a memory of an uncomplicated era time in his youth, when sitting by the water was completely sufficient. He allowed his attention to shift to the evening sounds, the crickets beginning their ancient nighttime chorus, the leaves whispering secrets to one another in the dark, and a solitary nightbird calling out once before settling into the quiet. His breathing began to slow down automatically, not because he was forcing a specific pattern, but because human breath functions exactly like water. It naturally finds its own equilibrium the moment we stop disrupting it. You are entering this exact state right now. With every single breath you release, the ripples within your internal basin are softening. You do not have to exert any willpower to make this happen. It unfolds entirely on its own. It is the natural mechanism of the body, unfolding the way blossoms open when the warm sun touches them, or the way great rivers effortlessly find their way to the absolute gravity of the sea. It is the way you slide into deep sleep the moment you stop chasing it. The ancient ones taught that true peace originates entirely from within. It can never be found by searching outside yourself. When they shared this insight, they were not adding another burden to your endless daily task list. They were revealing an uncomplicated secret, the peace you have been hunting for in tomorrow's milestones, in the validation of others, in the illusion of flawless circumstances, or in the next purchase or achievement, is already fully present. It has always been here, waiting quietly beneath the surface waves like a forgotten treasure resting at the bottom of a clear lake. Think of the last time you truly watched a magnificent sunset. You were not scrolling through a digital screen or planning the logistics of dinner. You simply gave it your complete, undivided attention. For a brief interval, the internal commentator in your head went completely silent. You were not calculating your responsibilities or reviewing notifications. You were simply present, completely integrated with the shifting colors of the sky. That is your natural basin of still water. It does not require a sunset to exist. It only requires you to stop agitating the surface. The traveler opened his eyes. The final light of day had almost vanished, but he could clearly see the surface of the pool. It had stilled completely, becoming like solid glass. His reflection had returned, but it appeared altered. The lines of exhaustion and worry remained on his face, but his relationship to them had shifted. He was no longer fighting his own countenance. He was simply observing it with the compassion one offers to an old dear friend. He asked the guide how long a soul must labor to find a lasting state of stillness. The guide smiled, his expression holding a beautiful balance of cosmic humor and human kindness, explaining that the water never keeps score of the time it takes to clear. It simply returns to its fundamental nature the moment the wind passes. And your mind will do exactly the same. This exact restoration is happening to you right now. As these words wash over your awareness like gentle water, something deep within your consciousness is settling into place. Those urgent, racing thoughts may still exist, but they are merely floating lightly on the ultimate surface of your mind. You are sinking peacefully beneath them, drifting down into the calm depths that remain entirely undisturbed even when the surface weather is stormy. In our hyper-connected world, we have systematically forgotten the art of being still. We wake up to aggressive alarms that jolt our nervous systems out of rest. We check our digital screens before our feet have even touched the floor. We consume an endless stream of updates and notifications before we have even nourished our bodies. Our minds become like a choppy, agitated sea, never receiving a single window of time to clear the sediment and reflect reality with accuracy. We have built a collective culture where stillness is mislabeled as laziness, where silence is feared as loneliness, and where doing nothing is judged as an absolute failure. But your physical body remembers the reality of stillness. It knew this peace intimately when you were floating in the warm, protective darkness of the Womba state of perfect containment and complete security, completely unburdened by conceptual thought. It knew this peace when you were a child, capable of staring at dust motes dancing in a shaft of afternoon sunlight, completely absorbed in the spectacle, with all awareness of time entirely suspended. Your body still holds this knowledge in this very moment, even if your thoughts are still chattering in the background. Even if a part of your intellect is insisting that you cannot afford to rest, you can choose to trust this baseline quiet. The guide rose to take his leave, his movements holding the fluid, weightless grace of water itself necessary, purposeful, yet entirely unhurried. Before he stepped back into the forest, he placed a hand gently upon the traveler's shoulder. It was a brief moment of physical contact, but it carried a wordless transmission of absolute reassurance. He reminded the traveler that the water does not hold a grudge against the wind. It possesses an infinite patience with the shifting weather systems of the world. Knowing its true nature is always undisturbed. You can place your absolute trust in this mechanism tonight. Tomorrow, when anxiety attempts to visit your awareness, when your mind begins to spin elaborate narratives about everything that could go wrong, and when your internal weather turns stormy, Remember the deep basin. Let your breathing become like a soft, gentle rain falling upon the surface of the water. Now each slow exhalation smooths out the landscape of your mind a little more. There is absolutely nothing you need to fix tonight, nothing you need to alter, and nothing you need to improve. The water already knows how to settle. You already know how to rest. As we transition from this narrative, feel how its essence lingers within your chest, within the rhythm of your breath, and within the wide, spacious gaps opening between your thoughts. The traveler remained by the water until the great constellations filled the night sky. He did not resolve his worldly problems that evening, nor did he experience a sudden dramatic revelation, but something significant loosened within his chest. A protective fist that had been clenched tight for years finally began to open up, and within that opening peace entered. It was not a dramatic, loud peace, but a quiet, foundational sense of release, a soft realization that he could finally stop fighting the water. This is my absolute wish for you as you rest tonight, that you feel that exact same loosening within your being, that same profound permission to stop fighting the currents of thought, and to let your internal waters remember their own original nature. And now, like a gentle stream flowing effortlessly into a quiet river, we move toward our next teaching, discovering the immense power of flexibility and learning how to bend so that we may never break. The architecture of the mountain willow. Within the same ancient forest where the quiet water rested, two entirely different living structures grew side by side. One was an ancient mountain cedar, possessing a thick trunk and a crown of proud, sprawling branches. Its bark was deeply grooved, resembling the weathered face of an elder who had fought through centuries of severe winters. The other was a graceful grove of wild river bamboo, slender-stemmed and always in motion, dancing with every passing breath of wind, as if attuned to a subtle music that other structures could not perceive. You have encountered these two archetypes within your own personality, haven't you? The proud cedar represents that rigid part of your mind that firmly believes strength is defined by absolute resistance, part that says yes to every single professional demand or social obligation, because uttering a boundary feels like an admission of absolute weakness. It is the aspect of yourself that insists on holding the entire sky up, even when your body is entirely exhausted, even when your nervous system is begging for rest, and even when your heart is whispering that it has had enough. The great cedar had stood in the center of the valley for over 2 centuries. It had witnessed the initial clearing of the land and watched generations of children grow into elders beneath its shade. It wore its massive size like an impenetrable suit of armor, deeply proud of every dense ring hidden within its trunk. When the summer gales blew through the valley, it stood completely immovable, matching the force of the wind with its own massive weight. When the torrential rains fell, its thick limbs wavered. It was, in every conventional sense, exactly what we are taught to admire by a demanding world: solid, dependable, immovable, and entirely unyielding. The bamboo grove operated under an entirely different understanding of existence. It had arrived in the valley much more recently, spreading out from a single delicate shoot into a highly connected, fluid community. Where the cedar stood completely isolated in its pride, the bamboo grew as a unified collective, their roots intertwined beneath the soil. Where the cedar chose absolute rigidity, the bamboo chose the path of the dance. Even the most microscopic movement of air would set the entire grove into motion, swaying back and forth in a continuous, elegant rhythm that looked like a physical prayer made visible to the forest. The proud cedar would frequently look down upon the swaying bamboo, shaking its massive crown of leaves in open disapproval, demanding to know why it capitulated so effortlessly to every minor breath of wind. It boasted of its own stance, standing completely firm against all external forces, never yielding an inch to the storm, and declaring this to be the definition of true strength. The bamboo would gently sway in response, its leaves creating a sound like rustling silk as it whispered back that perhaps strength possessed more than one countenance, and that what pride categorizes as absolute weakness, flexibility recognizes as ultimate wisdom. This exact debate is playing out within your consciousness right now. A certain part of your intellect insists that you must become harder, more resistant, and completely unyielding to the intense pressures of your life. It tells you that you must handle every responsibility without showing a single sign of fatigue, that you must never admit to overwhelm, and that you must be the immovable cedar for everyone around you, unbreakable, reliable, and entirely self-sufficient. But another aspect of your awareness, a deeper, significantly wiser layer, is beginning to question this exhausting narrative, wondering if there is an entirely different way to hold power. For years, their contrasting approaches defined the center of the forest. Season after season, the cedar grew thicker, more set in its immovable stance, while the bamboo grew taller, remaining hollow and entirely flexible. Travelers would rest within the massive shade of the cedar during the intense heat of summer, and children would play hide-and-seek within the moving columns of the bamboo grove, delighted by its continuous sway. Both structures were a valued part of the valley's ecosystem, but they could never find a common ground regarding the true nature of power. One evening, the northern sky darkened with an ominous speed. This was not the graceful, familiar transition of a summer sunset, but the bruised violet coloration of a massive superstorm that carried destructive intent. You know this variety of storm. It is the unexpected phone call that alters your reality in a matter of seconds. The sudden diagnosis that completely rewrites your projected future. The significant relationship that abruptly shatters without warning. Or the professional position that vanishes overnight. It represents life's winds arriving not as a gentle breeze but as a formatting hurricane. The storm hit the valley with unprecedented velocity. The rain descended not in individual drops, but in solid, heavy sheets that blinded the forest. The wind howled through the mountain passes like a living entity, its force registering as an absolute weight. Lightning ripped through the dark canopy, and thunder vibrated the very bedrock of the earth. It was the kind of environmental event that strips away all human illusions of absolute control, reminding us of our fundamental smallness in the grand architecture of nature. The great cedar responded exactly as it had trained for 200 years. It stood completely rigid. It clenched every single fiber of its wood, tightened every structural ring within its trunk, and dug its heavy roots deeper into the stone. It vowed that it would not bend a single inch to this atmospheric insolence, determined to prove its strength. But the force of the wind that night was stronger than ancestral pride, stronger than structural history, and far more powerful than individual willpower. As a massive twisting vortex of air slammed into the center of the valley, a sound like a tearing fabric split the darkness, a devastating crack that ended 2 centuries of slow, proud growth in a single fraction of a second. The great cedar collapsed to the forest floor with the immense weight of its own unyielding certainty, its root system torn from the earth, entirely still. The bamboo grove, throughout the long hours of the night, yielded completely to the force of the wind. It bent wildly with the gale, its slender stalks bowing so low that they nearly pressed flat against the muddy earth. Each individual stem curled toward the ground, appearing so fragile and overwhelmed that it seemed an absolute certainty they would be snapped from their roots. The gale threw them violently to the east, then slammed them to the west. The rain beat down upon them with punishing weight. They appeared completely helpless grass before a hurricane. But the bamboo never wasted an ounce of its energy, fighting the velocity of the wind. It danced with the storm. It gave itself over to the movement entirely, honoring the immense power of the gales without resisting its path. And when the dawn finally broke, when the storm had spent its destructive energy and drifted away over the mountains, a quiet miracle revealed itself. The bamboo stalks slowly, gracefully began to straighten. They were wet, disheveled, and covered in leaves, but they were entirely whole, still deeply rooted, still alive, and still capable of moving with the morning breeze. This is not a simple fable about the flora of a distant valley. It is a direct mirror of your life as you lie here tonight, carrying the weight of your own personal storms. Perhaps you have been playing the role of the rigid cedar, lately holding every aspect of your life in a state of tight, unyielding tension, operating under the false belief that if you just maintain absolute control, nothing can hurt your heart. You have built your identity on being completely unbreakable. But look honestly at what this strategy is costing your well-being. Feel your physical body in this exact moment. Note the specific areas where you are habitually holding tight to tension. Your shoulders may be raised toward your ears like defensive shields. Your jaw might be clenched tightly against words you have left unspoken. Your abdomen may be tight with the projected anxieties of tomorrow. That is your internal cedar tree, still frantically trying to resist winds of events that have already passed through your life, still bracing for defensive battles that ended years ago. The ancient wisdom traditions remind us that psychological suffering does not originate from pain itself, but from our internal resistance to that pain. The bamboo understood this truth within its very core. It did not pretend that the hurricane was not dangerous, nor did it minimize the severity of the wind. It simply made the conscious choice not to add its own opposing force to the conflict. It chose the path of alignment over the path of war. Think of the last time you encountered a significant difficulty, perhaps an intense criticism from someone whose approval you deeply valued. Your cedar mind immediately went rigid, constructing walls of defense, explaining your behavior, and mobilizing mental arguments to prove your absolute rightness. But consider what would have occurred if you had chosen the path of the bamboo. Instead, if you had softened your posture, taken a slow breath, and allowed the words to pass through your awareness without shattering your core. Bending does not diminish your worth, it preserves your freedom. As you listen to the steady rhythm of my voice, you are gradually absorbing the secret of the bamboo grove. Every slow exhalation of breath is a minor bow to reality. Every conscious release of physical tension is a gentle yielding to the present moment. You are not becoming weak or passive. You are becoming profoundly wise. You are discovering that ultimate resilience is not about preventing yourself from ever falling, but about learning how to rise with grace. Your life has invited you to bend on many occasions, when carefully laid plans dissolve despite your best efforts, when a significant love changed its form without your permission, or when your physical body demanded rest while your ambition insisted on production. In each of these moments you held a clear choice: resistance or alignment, the path of the cedar or the path of the bamboo. Yielding is not the act of giving up, it is the act of giving over. It is surrendering to what is actually real, rather than exhausting your life force fighting for what should be. It is accepting the truth that we cannot command the winds of existence, but we can completely choose how we dance within their currents. Feel the structural landscape of your body right now. Where you were rigid when we began our journey, a profound softening is taking place. Your breath is discovering a wider internal space. Your muscles are remembering that they are not required to hold the weight of the entire world up tonight. Your heart is unclenching its protective borders. This is the process of you becoming bamboo, not through a sudden effort, but breath by conscious breath. The forest eventually integrated the loss of the great cedar. Though the children missed its shade, they discovered over time that its fall created an unexpected space of beauty. Wildflowers that had spent 2 centuries waiting in the darkness for a glimpse of the sun finally erupted into glorious bloom. Small forest creatures constructed secure homes within its decaying trunk, and its fading wood enriched the soil, nourishing new growth. Even in its absolute ending, it served the continuation of life, and the bamboo grove continued its steady, connected expansion, sending its wisdom through an intricate network of underground roots. New shoots appeared with every passing spring, each one holding the ancestral knowledge within its very matrix, the understanding of how to bend, how to adapt, and how to survive by yielding to the flow of reality. Tomorrow, when life presents its inevitable pressures, you will hold a fresh choice. You can play the role of the cedar, meeting force with opposing force, or you can step into the wisdom of the bamboo grove, secure in your internal flexibility, bending gracefully so that you may never break, and moving in harmony with difficulty rather than declaring war upon it. The grove is whispering its secret to your awareness right now, and it sounds exactly like the rise and fall of your breathing, soft, rhythmic, continuous, never forcing a single cycle, always returning to center. You are growing toward a grace that can hold anything. The empty vessel of the scholar. A young intellectual once journeyed across many provinces to secure an audience with an old teacher who lived in a remote mountain dwelling. The scholar's mind was remarkably full, resembling a modern digital screen featuring dozens of open windows, each one flash notifying an urgent alert. each one competing for a fraction of limited attention. He possessed advanced degrees from prestigious institutions, held the capacity to quote complex classical philosophies from memory, and had authored academic treatises that had deeply impressed his mentors. Yet, despite this massive accumulation of information, a foundational piece completely eluded his grasp. Internal tranquility slipped through his fingers like dry sand through a clenched fist. Does this internal state sound familiar to your awareness? Consider how many non-fiction books you have systematically consumed in your search for the ultimate answer. How many intellectual podcasts you have listened to while doing chores, or how many complex psychological techniques you have attempted to practice, each one promising to be the definitive key to your well-being, yet each one adding another layer of conceptual noise to an already overcrowded mind. The scholar had heard intriguing whispers regarding this specific teacher. It was said that he possessed a unique method of instruction, that he taught without relying on dense lectures, and that individuals departed his presence fundamentally altered not by the words he uttered, but by the space he maintained. The intellectual journey to the master's mountain hut was physically demanding, requiring the scholar to navigate steep paths that challenged his soft feet, and to walk through dense forests where the only sound was the rhythm of his own breathing. With every step he took, his internal mental arguments seemed to grow louder. An arrogant internal voice insisted that he had already mastered the foundational texts and questioned what a simple hermit could possibly add to his understanding. But a quieter, more intuitive voice urged him forward. When he finally reached the clearing, the simplicity of the master's dwelling caught him off guard. It was an unpretentious structure of timber and clay that appeared to have grown organically from the mountainside itself. A thin column of blue smoke rose peacefully from the stone chimney, and a small garden showed clear signs of recent care. It was entirely ordinary, and within that absolute lack of pretense lay its true extraordinary nature. The teacher met him at the wooden threshold, an elderly man whose eyes held a distinct quality of quiet amusement, as if he found the entire universe, including the scholar's obvious exhaustion and hidden vanity, to be a source of gentle joy. He welcomed the traveler warmly, noting his fatigue, and invited him to sit by the fire. The scholar bowed with formal precision and immediately launched into an elaborate self-introduction, eager to establish his intellectual credentials. He boasted of his extensive analysis of classic treatises, his conceptual comprehension of reality, and his daily hours-long meditation practice. He detailed his studies with renowned academic authorities, yet confessed that a lasting internal peace continually escaped his grasp, demanding to know what advanced concept or technique he had yet to master. The teacher listened to this torrent of words with absolute presence, his countenance expressing neither approval nor judgment. When the scholar finally paused to draw a breath, the old man smiled warmly and suggested they prepare a simple pot of tea. "You have played the role of this frantic scholar on many occasions, haven't you? You search for peace within the architecture of information, looking for rest in the next self-help book, the next productivity framework, or the next conceptual understanding. You operate under the false assumption that if you just acquire enough data, understand the psychological mechanisms well enough, or accumulate enough spiritual credentials, you will finally grant yourself permission to feel like you are enough. But the internal void within your chest seems to expand with every conceptual layer you attempt to pour into it." The old man moved about the small room with a beautiful, unhurried ease, heating mountain water over a small, crackling flame and selecting dried tea leaves with the absolute focus that others reserve for rare gems. The scholar watched him with growing impatience, his mind already forming complex counter-arguments about the inefficient use of his valuable time, wanting to bypass the pleasantries and arrive at the advanced secret doctrine. He failed to perceive that the core teaching was already unfolding before his eyes. When the mountain water had boiled, the teacher placed a ceramic cup before the scholar and began to pour. The amber liquid rose steadily within the vessel, releasing a rich aroma of earth and wild herbs. It reached the halfway mark, then rose to fill 3/4 of the cup, and soon reached the absolute brim. But the old man's hand remained steady, continuing to pour without a single pause. The tea overflowed the brim, spilling into the ceramic saucer beneath it. Still the master poured. The liquid filled the saucer, ran over the edges onto the polished wooden table, began to saturate the expensive fabric of the scholar's academic robes, and dripped steadily onto the floor. The scholar leaped backward in a state of shock and irritation, shouting for the master to stop because the cup was full and could hold no more. The old man set the earthenware pot down on the table with absolute gentleness. He looked directly into the scholar's startled eyes, his gaze holding that same quiet, loving amusement, explaining that the scholar was exactly like the overflowing cup, so completely full of his own theories, opinions, and pre-established conclusions that there was absolutely no interior space left to receive anything new. The scholar sat down in stunned silence, the wet fabric of his robes a cold reminder of his reality. For the first time in his adult life, his analytical intellect was completely stopped. He had absolutely nothing to say right now. In this quiet darkness, your internal vessel is overflowing as well. It is filled to the brim not only with worldly data, but with the heavy stones of tomorrow's anxieties, the endless loops of yesterday's regrets, and the rigid stories you continuously tell yourself about who you are and who you can never be. It is full of certainties that act as invisible prisons for your spirit. The ancient ones spoke of cultivating the beginner's mind, not an intellect that is ignorant or uneducated, but a consciousness that is fundamentally willing to hold its knowledge lightly. It is a mind that is open to seeing reality with completely fresh eyes, meeting every single moment as if encountering existence for the very first time. Children inhabit this state naturally. They look at a common field flower as if they have just witnessed the birth of color itself. They listen to the sound of rain falling upon a rooftop as if it were the first symphony ever performed on earth. When did you abandon this capacity? When did your internal vessel become so full of definitions and expectations that the simple wonder of being alive could no longer find a square inch of open space? Feel the contents of your cup in this moment. Perhaps it holds a running negative commentary regarding your current standing in life. The thought that you should be further along, that you are too old to change, or that nothing works for your anxiety. These repetitive thoughts are merely old tea that has gone cold, stagnant, and intensely bitter. They have been sitting within your vessel for so long that you have mistakenly begun to believe they are part of the cup itself. But they are not. They are simply old contents that can be poured away. The scholar remained at the mountain hut for 3 days. Initially, his analytical intellect raged against the simplicity of the routine, treating it as an absolute waste of his potential. But slowly, the repetitive rhythms of the clearing began to work on his nervous system. They swept the wooden floors together in absolute silence. Eventually, the conceptual narrative ran out of energy, replaced by the smooth texture of the wooden handle and the immediate reality of care. They prepared simple meals from the garden. His abstract theories faded away, replaced by the simple miracle of reality revealing itself without the need for intellectual commentary. You are emptying your own vessel right now, in this very darkness. With every slow, deliberate exhalation of your breath, something heavy is being released from your consciousness. You do not need to empty it forever. You only need to empty it for tonight. You only need to make just enough room for peace to enter. In our production-driven culture, emptiness is judged as an absolute failure. But within the space of inner freedom, emptiness is recognized as entirely sacred. It is the empty cup that holds the capacity to receive the fresh water. It is the empty mind that can finally experience true rest. On the final evening of his stay, the teacher poured tea for the scholar once more. This time, he utilized a clean, fresh cup. This time, his hand paused the moment the amber liquid reached the perfect level, noting that they could finally begin their conversation. The scholar tasted the tea, and for the first time in his existence, he truly experienced the beverage, because his cup was finally empty. The riddle of the solitary hand. A young practitioner named Tenzin was burning with an intense, agonizing desire to achieve ultimate understanding. This was not the ordinary, mundane curiosity regarding how the mechanics of the world functioned, but the deep, existential hunger to know the fundamental essence of reality. He meditated until his legs lost all physical sensation, studied the classical treatises until his eyes burned with fatigue, and pushed his body through rigorous disciplines until the spiritual practice itself transformed into another form of aggressive, exhausting striving. Yet, despite this ferocious investment of willpower, the shore of true liberation remained an incredibly distant concept. His mentor observed this frantic, muscle-bound effort with a quiet compassion. He recognized that it was time for a teaching that could never be grasped by the analytical intellect, a truth that could only be accessed through total surrender. One morning, as Tenzin sat before him, his posture tense with the expectation of receiving an advanced philosophical text to analyze, the master leaned forward and presented him with an unanswerable riddle cone, specifically engineered to break the mind's addiction to solving problems. The master asked him to reveal the sound of a single hand clapping. Tenzin blinked in complete confusion, his analytical intellect immediately stuttering. He asked if the master meant the sound generated when the left palm impacts the right, but the teacher smiled, clarifying that he was asking for the resonance of a solitary palm entirely on its own. You are deeply familiar with this exact psychological state, aren't you? Life frequently presents your awareness with impossible, unanswerable riddles. They are the agonizing questions that keep you awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, turning them over and over in your mind like sharp stones that refuse to become smooth. Why did this specific loss happen to my life? What is the absolute purpose of my existence? Will I ever achieve a state of permanent security? When will I finally feel like I have done enough to earn my place on this earth? These are problems that cannot be solved by the logic of the intellect, yet the mind continues to attack them with desperate energy. Tenzin mobilized his entire logical apparatus to address the master's challenge. First, he clapped his single hand against his own bare chest, producing a dull, thudding sound. He rushed to the master's room to present this solution, but the teacher shook his head, noting that it was merely the sound of a hand impacting flesh, requiring two structures to meet. Next, Tenzin waved his single hand through the air with extreme velocity, creating a distinct whooshing sound. The master observed that it was merely the friction of displacement, the sound of the wind, not the single hand. He tried snapping his fingers, but the teacher noted that it was still two biological components colliding. Weeks passed into months, and Tenzin's frustration expanded until it felt like a tight, agonizing knot located directly behind his breastbone. He began to explore highly abstract philosophical responses, declaring the sound to be absolute silence, or the entire universe vibrating as one each time. The master rejected his answers, urging him to stop attempting to be clever, because the answer was not located within the architecture of his thinking. This is the exact trap your mind constructs during the hours of deep night. It takes an unanswerable existential dilemma and treats it like a linear mathematical equation. It insists that if you just think with more intensity, if you analyze the variables from one more perspective, or if you read one more article, you will finally discover the missing piece of the puzzle. But what if the specific questions tormenting your awareness are not designed to be solved at all? What if their true structural purpose is to completely dissolve the aspect of your identity that is addicted to solving? Tenzin sat with this impossible question until his intellectual machinery simply ran out of fuel. His mind fought like a wild bird captured within an iron cage, beating its wings frantically against the unyielding bars of the unanswerable. The exhaustion of trying to think his way into a state of peace became absolute. The internal wheels of his intellect were spinning with immense speed, yet they were merely creating a cloud of dust without producing a millimeter of forward movement. Then, a fundamental shift began to take place within his consciousness. It did not unfold as a dramatic flash of insight, but like ice slowly beginning to crack under the gentle warmth of an early spring sun. Tenzin completely stopped looking for the correct answer. He abandoned the search for a clever definition and simply allowed his awareness to feel directly into the question itself. What if the ultimate point of the koan was not to find a hidden sound? What if its true purpose was to reveal what remains when the mechanism of searching completely collapses? He began to notice things he had been entirely too busy to register before. He became intensely aware of the raw sound of his own breathing, the soft, scraping texture of air moving through his throat. He noted the dry rustle of his cotton robes against his skin as he walked across the courtyard. He began to perceive that the ambient silence of the monastery was not a hollow void, but a living presence, a vast, unconditioned field of awareness that required absolutely no spoken words to maintain its integrity. One morning, as the first rays of dawn painted the ancient stone walls of the garden in shades of pale gold, Tenzin sat motionless on his cushion, a single leaf detached from a high branch, spiraling down through the crisp air in perfect, absolute silence. He watched its descent with a complete, unfragmented absorption. There was no conceptual commentary in his head, no analytical voice labeling the event. There was simply the visual movement of the leaf and the unmoving awareness that witnessed it. And within that absolute absence of commentary, he suddenly understood the riddle. He did not comprehend it with his logical brain, he realized it with his entire being. The sound of the single hand is not an acoustic phenomenon at all. It is the foundational silence that holds all sounds. It is the wide, unconditioned space that exists between your thoughts in this very moment. It is the primary awareness that is currently listening to the sound of my voice. It is who you have always been before you first learned to construct concepts, before you learned the art of worry, and before you were taught that you needed to transform yourself into something other than what you intrinsically are. The ancient ones frequently reminded their followers that their teachings functioned exactly like a finger, pointing directly at the beauty of the moon, warning them not to focus exclusively on the finger, or they would completely miss the celestial glory of the heavens. Your analytical mind spends its entire existence focusing on fingers, analyzing the angle of the pointing, measuring the mechanics of the gesture, and debating the intellectual validity of the technique. But tonight, just for this window of rest, you are beginning to perceive what the pointers are actually indicating. You are sensing the vast, unconditioned quietude that accommodates everything in existence. Tenzin ran to his mentor's quarters, but when he stepped through the door, he discovered that he had absolutely no words to offer. He simply stood before his teacher, raised a single hand into the air, and smiled from the depth of his chest. The master opened his eyes, and his face instantly crinkled with a profound joy, noting that his student could finally hear the melody. What are you registering right now in the quiet of this room? Beyond the sound of my voice, there is a steady presence, isn't there? It is an internal knowing that requires no logical proof, a foundational contentment that demands no external validation, and a deep peace that requires absolutely no effort to earn. You do not need to figure out the logistics of tomorrow. You can simply exist right here, listening to the resonance of the single hand, resting in the quiet spaces of your own being. The farmer's shifting fortune. There was an elderly farmer who resided in a rural valley, and he understood a core truth that most human beings spend entire lifetimes entirely missing. He had spent his existence living in absolute harmony with the seasons, his hands deeply familiar with the architecture of the soil, and his eyes capable of reading complex weather transitions in the structural formations of the clouds. But his deepest layer of wisdom was not concerned with crop yields or meteorological indicators. It was focused entirely on the elaborate narratives we construct about our reality, and how those stories quickly become our internal prisons. His modest farm was situated at the outermost edge of a small village, precisely where the rocky base of the mountains touched the sky. He was neither wealthy nor poor, possessing just enough resources to sustain his household. His primary asset was a single horse, a strong, loyal creature that had assisted him in plowing the terraced fields for many years. The farmer's days followed a clean, uncomplicated rhythm, rising with the initial light, working the earth, consuming simple food, and resting deeply when the dark returned. There was no internal drama in his approach, no desire for philosophical debate. Life lived close to the heartbeat of the ground. One morning, the farmer woke to discover that his wooden corral fence had broken apart. The loyal horse was entirely gone. Its hoofprints led directly toward the high mountain passes, where herds of wild horses were known to roam free. By the hour of noon, the entire village had gathered at his perimeter. News travels with immense speed in isolated places where life is generally quiet. The neighbors stood by the broken fence, shaking their heads in open dismay, declaring it to be an absolute stroke of terrible fortune and a complete economic disaster for his household. The old farmer looked out toward the distant mountains, where his horse had vanished into the mist. He remained quiet for a long interval, his face expressionless. Finally, he said simply, "Perhaps it is, and perhaps it is not." The neighbors exchanged glances of complete lifestyle bewilderment. His primary means of survival had just walked away into the wilderness, yet the old man was already moving methodically to mend the broken boards of his fence working, with a steady, unhurried precision, as if losing an asset and mending a fence were equally valid parts of a life. You have been systematically trained by a reactive world to label every single life event, instantly categorizing experiences immediately as good or bad, success or failure, blessing or curse. Your analytical intellect operates exactly like a frantic sorting mechanism, slamming experiences into rigid boxes before they have even finished unfolding in reality. That sudden promotion is labeled as good. That physical illness is categorized as bad. That relationship ending is declared a disaster. That missed opportunity is stamped as a failure. But are you certain? Are you absolutely sure of that evaluation? 3 days later, the rhythmic sound of multiple hoofbeats awakened the valley. The farmer's horse had returned, but it did not arrive alone. 3 magnificent wild horses followed it into the corral, drawn by its familiarity, stepping through the mended gate as if they had always belonged within the enclosure. The neighbors instantly gathered once more, their countenances shifting from pity to absolute celebration, exclaiming over his incredible fortune and declaring that the gods were smiling brightly upon his household. The old farmer methodically distributed grain to all 4 creatures, his steady movements entirely unaltered by this sudden influx of wealth. "Perhaps it is," he murmured softly, "and perhaps it is not. Consider the trajectory of your own existence for a moment. Think of that specific professional position you desperately wanted in your youth but failed to secure. Where did that redirection eventually lead your life? Think of that painful relationship that concluded, breaking your heart into pieces. What beautiful internal qualities grew within that broken space? Can you really state with absolute logical certainty that what your mind initially labeled a disaster was exclusively negative?" The following week, the farmer's son decided to begin the process of training one of the wild horses. He was young, ambitious, and eager to demonstrate his bravery to the village. The creature he selected was magnificent, but its spirit was entirely untamed. The wild horse bucked with immense violence, throwing the young man high into the air. He landed heavily upon the rocky ground, and the distinct sound of fracturing bone echoed across the field. His leg was badly shattered, the variety of deep structural break that requires months of absolute immobility to heal. The neighbors rushed to the farmhouse, their voices tight with lamentation, crying out over the terrible misfortune, noting that it happened right before the harvest and declaring the wild horses to be a curse. The old farmer tended to his son's fractured limb with remarkably gentle hands. He prepared soothing poultices from wild herbs, adjusted the wooden splints with precision, and brought warm soup and stories to his bedside. When the villagers questioned him about this great misfortune, he looked down at his son alive, healing, and completely present in the room, answering simply that perhaps it was, and perhaps it was not. Right now, in this phase of your life, something within your world might feel completely broken. Your mind wants to rush forward and write the definitive ending to the book. But what if the narrative is not even close to finished? What if your awareness is currently resting on page 3 of a massive, beautiful story that spans 50 chapters? A short time later, a violent border conflict erupted across the outer provinces, and a military contingent arrived in the village with strict conscription orders. Every able-bodied young man was required to enlist immediately. The valley erupted into a space of absolute grief as young men were forcibly marched away to battles from which many would never return. The military officers entered the old farmer's dwelling, noted the heavy wooden splints bound to the son's leg, shook their heads in disapproval, and moved on to the next house. The neighbors, their faces wet with tears of profound grief, looked upon the old farmer with entirely new eyes, realizing that what they had called a misfortune had become his ultimate protection. The old farmer said absolutely nothing on this occasion. He did not need to utter a word. His eyes held that same steady, unfluctuating acknowledgement of reality. The ancient ones reminded us that true psychological suffering originates from our rigid attachment to specific outcomes and, more subtly, our attachment to our narratives about those outcomes. The farmer's wisdom was never born of cold indifference or emotional numbness. He felt his natural feelings fully, but he systematically refused to let his temporary emotional reactions harden into absolute conceptual facts. He remained soft, curious, and entirely open to the ongoing unfolding of the story. Tonight, your own grip on absolute certainty is beginning to loosen its hold. The freedom is immediate when you recognize that life is writing a story far bigger than your immediate understanding. The teaching of the twin shafts. The ancient teacher was sitting with a circle of practitioners in a quiet grove one afternoon when a novice approached their perimeter. This individual carried immense invisible weight. You could perceive its presence clearly in the heavy, dragging quality of his footsteps, in the tight protective line of his raised shoulders, and in his eyes which were cast down, entirely unable to meet the gaze of his companions. He confessed that despite years of practice, meditation, and study, intense psychological pain continuously found his life, demanding to know why he still experienced such intense suffering. If that methodology was truly functional. The teacher looked upon the young man with eyes that held a profound, validating compassion. He remained entirely silent for several minutes, allowing the young man's pain to occupy the room completely, refusing to rush forward with a superficial explanation. Finally he spoke, describing the reality of the two arrows. He asked the novice to imagine a person walking through a dense forest who is suddenly struck by a rogue arrow. The shaft pierces the flesh, creating an immediate physical wound and a sharp, intense sensation of pain. This is the baseline condition of inhabiting a human form, the first arrow, which everyone who lives a human life will inevitably feel. You are deeply familiar with the trajectory of this first arrow. It arrives as the unexpected phone call from a medical professional, the empty chair at the evening dinner table, or the sudden professional downsizing. Life releases these initial arrows, not because you have committed a moral error, but simply because everything in this physical world is subject to the law of constant change. The teacher continued, explaining that a secondary mechanism is typically activated next. The individual struck by the initial shaft begins to look down at the wound and spiral into thoughts of bitterness, questioning why they were targeted, declaring it unfair, and insisting their future is ruined. These cascading thoughts, this elaborate narrative of victimization, resistance, and despair, is the second arrow, the shaft that we actively choose to shoot into our own hearts. The novice began to understand that the purpose of spiritual practice was not to construct an impenetrable armor that prevents the first arrow from ever finding the flesh, but rather to master the relationship with the second arrow, learning the art of putting the bow down. Think about your own accumulated pain in this quiet room. Is there a specific hurt within your history that was initially a clean wound, but transformed into a lifelong trauma because of the destructive narrative your mind constructed around it? Perhaps someone chose to depart your life. That is the first arrow. But did your analytical mind immediately reach for the bow and add the story that you are fundamentally unlovable? Those are all second arrows, shot from your own internal bow directly into an already bleeding heart. The most magnificent truth available to your awareness tonight is that the second arrow is entirely optional. When asked how to interrupt the automatic reflex of the second arrow, the teacher explained the method of the conscious pause. When an experience of pain arrives, allow your system to breathe. Notice the secondary stories attempting to mobilize, and make the conscious choice not to believe their commentary. Instruct your awareness to acknowledge the first arrow fully, while choosing to lay the secondary bow down upon the earth. Right now, within your physical body, there may be the presence of old arrows, ancient wounds that never quite healed cleanly. Can you allow yourself to feel their presence tonight without adding a single line of narrative commentary? You do not need to be completely invulnerable or arrow-proof to experience internal peace. You only need to stop shooting yourself over and over with your own thoughts. Let your system heal without adding the heavy weight of suffering to the clean reality of pain. The tea ceremony of the mind. Following the exploration of the arrows we shoot into our own wounds, let us allow our awareness to rest within an entirely simpler territory, the ordinary human action of preparing a warm beverage. There was a legendary tea master named Rikyu who understood a profound secret of the spiritual path. Ultimate awakening is not an exotic state reserved exclusively for silent meditation halls or distant mountain clearings. It is fully present within the absolute simplicity of the everyday moment, in the steam rising gracefully from a ceramic cup, in the immediate physical weight of an earthenware bowl resting in your palms, and in the quiet pause that occurs before your lips meet the liquid. A highly successful commercial merchant once traveled across the provinces to visit the master's tea house. This was a man who had successfully acquired everything the world deemed valuable: immense financial wealth, widespread social respect, and a commercial empire that dominated the markets. But this worldly success had slowly transformed into an invisible, exhausting prison. His mind operated as a continuous calculation mechanism. Every human conversation was evaluated as a transaction, and every single moment of his existence was measured on a strict balance sheet of profit and loss. He declared his desire to systematically master the state of internal peace, treating it like another asset to be aggressively acquired, another line item to be added to his impressive professional resume. This is precisely how we frequently approach our own paths of personal growth, isn't it? We treat rest like a competitive milestone we must achieve, missing the foundational truth that peace is never found at the summit of achievement, is found in the graceful act of putting down your climbing gear. Rikyu smiled with infinite gentleness and led the stressed merchant into the simple tea house. The room was entirely minimalist, almost bare, consisting of basic woven mats, a simple alcove holding a single seasonal flower, and the unpretentious utensils required for the preparation of tea. The wealthy merchant looked around the empty space in complete confusion, demanding to know where the sacred scrolls and complex texts of wisdom were hidden. Rikyu replied softly that first they must simply prepare a pot of tea. You are often identical to this merchant, hunting for internal calm within the architecture of complexity. But what if the peace you are chasing is already fully present, waiting quietly within the absolute simplicity of the immediate task before you, completely hidden in plain sight? Rikyu began the simple ceremony, heating the water as if it were the solitary absolute event occurring in the entire universe. The merchant watched him with immediate impatience, his mind calculating the lost time and financial cost of his inactivity. But something in the absolute presence of Rikyu's movements began to exert a powerful influence upon the merchant's nervous system. The complete, unfragmented attention granted to every single microaction transmitted a profound lesson. This immediate moment matters completely. This simple action is entirely sufficient. This current breath is absolutely whole. When you prepare your morning beverage, where is your attention residing? Is your mind already at work rehearsing tense conversations, constructing complex to-do lists, and managing logistics? Your physical body remains stuck in the kitchen, while your mind is already racing 5 miles down the road, and then you wonder why you feel so fundamentally scattered. Rikyu whisked the tea into a gentle froth, creating a soft sound like the wind moving through pine needles. When the beverage was ready, he rotated the ceramic bowl with care, presenting its best side to his guest. This minor gesture of consideration broke through the merchant's defensive armor, and his eyes filled with tears as he realized he could not remember the last time he had experienced an action free from calculation. He asked for the core teaching of the lineage, and Rikyu replied that he was currently drinking it. The profound peace you are hunting for in tomorrow's milestone is fully available within the immediate sip of water. The deep calm you are chasing within future achievements is waiting quietly within your current inhalation. The merchant stayed with Rikyu for 3 hours, and with every bowl they shared, the merchant's analytical intellect slowed down its velocity. Rikyu noted that suffering arises exclusively when you are drinking your tea, while simultaneously managing your entire business empire within your thoughts. Right now, you are simply listening, simply resting, perfectly present in the simplicity of this moment. Projections on the mirror of the pond. The water of your mind has become remarkably quiet, now clear enough to observe a critical mechanism of human relationships. How frequently the precise things that cause our hearts to contract with anxiety are not actually present in reality, but are merely features we have projected onto our environment. There was a young practitioner named Koi, who was remarkably sincere in his spiritual dedication. Yet he found himself continuously caught within an agonizing psychological web of his own construction. He men perceived harsh criticism where there was only a quiet concern. He heard a message of absolute rejection within another's simple silence. He felt a heavy weight of negative judgment where there was nothing more than neutral observation. You have woven these exact threads within your own life, strand by strand, until your awareness filters everything through old relational pain and the expectation of future hurt. One evening, Koi went down to the monastery's pond to fetch fresh water. The moon was completely full, hanging low over the mountain ridges like a brilliant golden lantern. When he looked down into the dark water, there it was, a perfect, flawless golden orb floating elegantly upon the surface. For a brief moment, his awareness forgot that he was looking at a mere reflection, and his hand reached out toward the water, hoping to touch its beauty. His fingers encountered nothing but cold liquid, and the image instantly shattered into 1,000 fragmented pieces of light. Koi jerked his hand back in a state of panic, terrified that his clumsy touch had destroyed something precious and eternal. But as he stood there watching the water slowly return to its natural equilibrium, the fragments began to merge back together, returning to a state of flawless wholeness upon the surface. The real moon was hanging completely untouched in the vast sky above, entirely unaffected by the ripples of the pond. The abbot found Koi standing by the water and explained the lesson gently. The moon within the pond is identical to the thoughts we construct regarding what others think of our worth. We observe their outer actions, but we view them through the agitated water of our own conditioned minds. What fear interprets as anger might be nothing more than personal fatigue. What self-doubt reads as rejection might be nothing more than immediate distraction. How many moons have you broken within your thoughts that were never actually broken in reality? How many precious human relationships have you complicated by reacting with defensiveness to reflections that existed nowhere outside the water of your own mind? Think of a specific person within your immediate life right now, someone whose recent interaction left your system feeling unsettled. They uttered a specific phrase or failed to send a message, and your mind instantly constructed an elaborate narrative regarding what that action meant for your security. But was that narrative actually their reality, or was it entirely yours? Koi spent the following weeks practicing a new discipline, observing not the behavior of his companions, but the movement of his own internal projections. When someone walked past without a greeting, he paused and recognized that they might be consumed by their own internal worries, completely independent of him. The shift was remarkably subtle, yet it transformed his entire psychological landscape. You are entering this clearer state of perception right now. The real moon, the unconditioned wholeness of your essential being, remains entirely untouched by any passing thoughts of inadequacy, completely pristine in the sky of your awareness. When you know you are looking at water, not sky, you can pause, take a slow breath, and allow the sediment to settle. The freedom is immediate when you stop fighting reflections that were never real. The chime of the silent tower. The external world never truly stops its ringing, does it? The constant chime of digital devices, the roar of urban transit, and the endless internal chatter of human voices populate our days. Even in this very room, in this midnight hour, you might perceive subtle sounds, the low hum of an appliance, the distant movement of traffic, or the whisper of your own thoughts. There was a secluded temple situated on a high ridge that was legendary for its massive bronze bell, cast by master craftsmen centuries ago. Its resonance was so pure and powerful that its sound could effortlessly travel across 3 distinct villages. When it was struck at the hour of dawn, It awakened the inhabitants of the valleys, called the practitioners to their cushions, and marked the passage of time with a tone so exquisite that people claimed it possessed the structural capacity to heal a conflicted heart. But during a severe winter storm, a massive landslide collapsed the timber supports of the bell tower. The striking mechanism was shattered, and the great bronze bell could no longer ring. The loss was felt instantly across the entire region, leaving the villagers in a state of deep disorientation, missing the mechanical coordination of their days. You understand this specific disorientation. When the continuous noise you have grown accustomed to is suddenly removed from your life, the resulting quietude can initially feel more disturbing than the static itself. It is like the moment a sudden power outage occurs in your home, and your awareness is suddenly confronted by the immense, heavy volume of an absolute silence. The monks attempted to repair the mechanism, but the damage was beyond their technical capacity. Weeks transitioned into months, and the bell hung entirely silent, a massive presence that no longer possessed an external voice. Then, an unexpected phenomenon began to manifest. People began journeying to the temple grounds anyway. They would sit quietly beneath the silent bell, close their eyes, and simply listen to the note ringing, discovering it possessed its own unique, beautiful resonance. This appears as a complete paradox to the logical intellect. But your deeper awareness understands this sound completely. It is the subtle reality you register in the brief space between your heartbeats. It is the profound pause that exists between your inhalation and your exhalation. Sitting beneath the silent tower, the villagers began to register aspects of reality they had been far too distracted to notice during the centuries of the bells. Chimey, direct texture of their own breathing, and the simple, profound miracle of being alive. A stressed mother once brought her hyperactive child to the ridge, despairing over his constant agitation. They sat together directly beneath the massive bronze structure. Slowly, the child grew curious about the absolute lack of noise, directing his attention toward the absence of sound, and within that vast vacancy, his nervous system discovered absolute rest. The abbot observed this transformation unfolding within the community and made a definitive statement. They would not rebuild the striking mechanism because the bell delivered its highest service by remaining silent. Sometimes the most profound teaching is located within what we do not execute, what we do not utter, and what we do not add to the world. In your human existence, you are constantly adding more variables, more commitments, more tasks, and more noise, thinking peace will arrive when the list is complete. But what if true peace only manifests when you make the conscious choice to stop? A high-level professional once visited the temple, demanding a powerful sound to cut through the chaos of voices in his head. The monks instructed him to simply sit beneath the silent bell. After hours of frustration, his mind finally surrendered, and he wept from a sense of profound relief, realizing the silence had been present under his thoughts his entire life. You are discovering that exact same quietude tonight, the drifting vessel. You are remarkably peaceful, now fully prepared to observe an internal mechanism that frequently disrupts your stability. The internal narratives we construct regarding who hurt our hearts and why they chose to do so. There was a practitioner named Shen who held a deep affection for the hours of early morning, long before the first light of dawn touched the valley. When the lake was as smooth and unmoving as dark glass, he would take a small wooden boat, row out to the absolute center of the water, and engage in silent meditation as the sun rose over the ridges. It was his daily sanctuary's absolute return to foundational quiet. One morning, wrapped in a blanket of thick white mist and absolute silence, he closed his eyes and settled into his meditation posture. His breathing slowed down to a deep, natural rhythm. Then a sudden, violent jolt shattered the quiet. Another vessel had crashed into his boat, the impact strong enough to rock him precariously, break his physical posture, and disrupt his meditation. Anger flared instantly within his chest, thought, defensive and completely righteous, spinning narratives of blame against whoever was operating the other vessel. He opened his eyes, fully prepared to lecture the offender regarding mindfulness and respect. But, as he focused his vision through the white mist, he saw that the colliding boat was completely empty. It was simply an old, weathered wooden boat that had slipped its knots at some distant dock, drifting aimlessly down the lake on the natural movement of the currents. Completely unaware that it had just shattered a monk's morning meditation, Shen sat completely stunned. His righteous anger was suddenly suspended in midair, possessing absolutely no target to land upon. He could not demand an apology from a hollow piece of timber, and within that absolute absence of a target, he experienced a profound psychological revelation. His intense anger had not been caused by the physical collision itself, but entirely by his internal assumption that an intentional malice had directed that force toward his life to cause him harm. How much of the psychological pain you carry within your history originates not from the actual events that took place, but from your deep, agonizing belief that an intentional malice directed those events toward your heart. When you begin to perceive the entities who hurt your life as empty boats, your righteous anger naturally transforms into a profound compassion. Shen began to perceive the presence of empty boats everywhere he looked in human society. When a merchant spoke to him with an acrid rudeness, he recognized the behavior as an empty Buddha consciousness, driven entirely by its own fears and internal static, entirely unable to see Shen at all. When a close companion forgot a significant event, it was an empty boat adrift within the complex current of her own personal struggles. Even his father, whose rigid criticisms had shaped the anxieties of his childhood, was revealed to be an empty boat, simply repeating the exact patterns that had been inflicted upon his own young awareness. This single perspective completely alters your relationship to your past wounds. The collision was a real event, and the wound may be real, but the prolonged suffering is generated entirely by the internal story, insisting that a malicious captain intentionally steered their vessel directly into yours to hurt you. Most of the time, there was no captain on board. They were simply drifting with closed eyes, entirely lost in the meditation of their own personal pain. You can choose to release the burden of blame tonight, the architecture of great silence. We are approaching the deep waters of our journey, now coming home to a reality that has been waiting for your return since the beginning of time. There was a renowned guide named Jinu who lived in a small timber temple situated at the absolute edge of a remote mountain settlement. He was known across multiple provinces, yet his reputation was not built upon the eloquence of his spoken sermons, his capacity to analyze complex texts, or his performance of grand rituals. Jinu was legendary across the land for his absolute silence. Seekers would travel for days, simply to sit in his physical presence and not to collect new concepts, but simply to be held within the deep pool of his quietude, to rest their exhausted minds within his stable presence. The temple grounds were remarkably simple, consisting of a few unpretentious wooden structures nestled comfortably among towering pine trees. But the most profound, healing sound within that sanctuary was the quality of Jinnah's silence. It was a warm, alive, and entirely spacious presence that held the room like a protective embrace. One autumn afternoon, a man arrived at the temple gates carrying an immense, invisible weight. His physical shoulders were bent forward, as if he were dragging a heavy stone cart through the mud, his hands moving with a constant, restless agitation. His eyes darted erratically across the courtyard, completely drowning within the chaotic torrent of his own thoughts. The attending guides recognized the signs and led him gently into the master's reception room. The space was entirely minimal, consisting of basic cushions resting on the clean timber floor, a low table holding a simple teapot, and a single wild flower in a plain vase. Jinu sat quietly in the corner of the room, his presence resembling a completely unmoving lake. The frantic man stepped through the threshold and immediately began to pour out his suffering in a torrent of words, detailing his failed marriage, his collapsing business, and his declining health, begging the master to hand him an answer. But before he could continue, Jinu raised his right hand slightly. The movement held the soft, weightless grace of a leaf detaching from a branch. The gesture was so entirely devoid of force that the man stopped speaking mid-sentence, his prepared script dying on his lips. The master simply gestured toward an empty cushion across from him on the timber, offering an open invitation to sit down. The man sat down, his system still fully mobilized to continue his long narrative. But within the stable, massive presence of Gina's silence, The prepared words began to feel suddenly unnecessary, resembling the act of bringing a tiny candle into the brilliant light of the midday sun. They sat facing one another, and without making a conscious effort, the frantic traveler's breathing began to naturally synchronize with the master's deep, slow rhythm. Minutes dissolved into hours, and the traveler's urgent compulsion to recite his history of grievances completely lost its force. During the second hour of the silence, the internal pushing stopped. The frantic man found himself just sitting, just breathing, and just being present in the room, allowed to exist without a hidden agenda or the crushing internal pressure to transform himself into something else. By the third hour, gentle tears began to flow from his eyes, the kind of water that naturally falls when long-held defensive armor finally dissolves from the system. Jinu did not move to comfort him. He simply stayed present, creating a vast, unconditional space where another soul could finally drop their armor. After 3 hours had passed, the man's tears ceased. He bowed deeply to the floor and departed the temple without another word. Yet something fundamental had altered within his baseline consciousness. He realized with clarity that he did not require answers. He required presencito be seen without the demand for a narrative. Jinu taught this way for 40 years, providing thousands of seekers with space from their problems rather than intellectual solutions. When a young student questioned why he refused to teach with words, Jinu spoke softly, noting that words add, while silence reveals. Words merely add more thoughts to an overcrowded mind, while silence reveals the peace, stillness, and wholeness that thoughts obscure. You are touching that exact same silence tonight, the map of universal grief. Certain narratives touch specific, tender spaces within our awareness that we spend our entire existences attempting to protect from the world. This is a teaching regarding the reality of grief, the nature of love, and the invisible thread that connects every single human heart across time. If you are currently carrying the heavy weight of a personal loss, this narrative is held for your awareness. During the era of the Ancient Ones, there lived a young woman named Kisa Gotami. Her name signified the frail one, but her physical slightness was entirely deceptive. Her capacity to love possessed a monumental strength. She had married a kind craftsman, and their shared existence was simple, unpretentious, and full of daily peace. And then her first child was born, a beautiful son who became the absolute light of her days. Then, on an ordinary morning, the light vanished. The boy woke with a high fever, and by the hour when the sun reached its peak in the sky, his little body went entirely still. For Kisa, the actual objective universe ceased to function. Only one reality remained solid: the cold weight of her child resting in her arms. Her analytical mind simply refused to process the information, convincing itself that he was merely sleeping deeply and required a specific medicine to awaken. She wrapped him carefully in his favorite blanket and went from house to house across the village, knocking heavily on every single door, begging for medicine. The villagers would look down at the still, lifeless bundle held tightly against her chest, their countenances crumbling with an absolute pity, gently trying to explain that the child was gone. But she was entirely deaf to their assertions, repeating mechanically that he needed medicine. Finally, an elder woman who understood her despair suggested she visit the Buddha, who was staying in a nearby cedar grove, noting that perhaps he possessed the understanding required to help her. Kisa half ran to the grove and laid the still bundle directly at his feet, pleading for medicine. The Buddha looked upon her with eyes filled with an absolute, validating compassion. He informed her that he could prepare the medicine she required, but first she must bring him a specific ingredient: a single handful of common mustard seeds. Kaisa's body sagged with relief, but the Buddha added a strict condition. The seeds must be gathered from a house where absolutely no one had ever died, a home entirely untouched by the shadow of grief. She hurried back to the settlement, knocking on the first threshold. The family gladly brought out their jar of seeds, but when Kisa added the master's condition, the family softened into sadness, sharing that death had visited their home many times before. She hurried to the next house, and encountering the exact same reality at every turn. Everyone possessed the seeds, but every single home had been touched by the reality of loss. As the sun began to sink below the western mountains, A profound transformation unfolded within Kai's consciousness. As the personal narratives of loss accumulated within her awareness, she realized she was systematically mapping a vast, interconnected landscape of human grief that covered every square inch of the village. She sat down at the edge of the forest and began to weep clean, gentle tears. She perceived it clearly now, the invisible thread of shared vulnerability that connected every home, every heart, and every life. Grief was revealed to be the unavoidable tax that human awareness pays for the privilege of love. When she returned to the Buddha, she brought no mustard seeds, but she carried an absolute understanding. She laid the bundle down gently at his feet, acknowledging that she could not locate a single threshold untouched by mortality, realizing she was not singled out by fate. The Buddha's teaching was never that we shouldn't grieve, but that we shouldn't grieve under the illusion of absolute isolation. We are all part of a vast web of hearts that have loved, lost, and possessed the courage to love again. Behind every face you pass in your daily life is a hidden story of loss. There is a strange, profound comfort in this universality. It does not make the pain less, but it makes the pain shared. Whatever you have lost, you are not alone in the dark tonight, the trajectory of the Mason's desire. You are drifting now within that deep, luminous quietude that naturally manifests after touching a profound, truthfully prepared to observe the exhausting circle of external seeking that travels far across the earth before finally bringing our awareness back to the exact place where we began. There was a humble stonecutter who labored at the absolute base of a massive mountain. Every single morning, his life followed a highly predictable, repetitive rhythm. Walking the familiar dirt path to the quarry, utilizing his hammer and chisels to shape the stone, the clear sound of iron impacting stone would echo through the quiet valley. Tap, 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 a rhythm as steady and reliable as his own heartbeat. He wasn't acutely unhappy, but he existed within that gray space where so many modern humans live, getting by, making do, occasionally wondering if this was all life had to offer. One afternoon, he delivered polished building stones to the estate of a wealthy merchant. The courtyard was like a classical painting, come-to-life fountains singing with clear water, and paths of white sand raked into patterns of absolute peace. He caught a glimpse of the merchant reclining comfortably on silk cushions, being served tea in delicate cups, and a sharp thought arose within his intellect. If only I inhabited his position. If only I possessed his immense wealth and comfort, then I would finally experience true happiness. And in that exact moment, the universe granted his wish. Suddenly, he was the merchant reclining on silk cushions surrounded by luxury. Initially, it was everything his imagination had promised. But a few months later, a regional prince passed through the town in a state procession. The merchant was required to bow his head to the earth, realizing that despite his wealth, he held no real sovereignty. He wished to become the prince, commanding thousands, and his reality shifted once more. Now he occupied the golden carriage, his decisions dictating the fate of provinces. But summer arrived, bringing a blazing, merciless heat that caused the prince to sweat with discomfort. Looking up at the blazing disk in the sky, he realized the sun ruled over everything, completely indifferent to political authority, and he wished to become the sun. He became the sun, blazing and radiant, but then a dark storm cloud drifted between him and the earth, blocking his light completely. Realizing a cloud could defeat his power without an ounce of effort, he wished to become the cloud, drifting freely across the sky. But as the wind pushed his form, he encountered a massive vertical barrier, the great mountain peak, which stood completely unmoved by his torrents of rain. He wished to become the mountain, eternal and unmoving as the mountain. He experienced a peace he had never known before, remaining immovable across cosmic ages. This felt like true purpose. Until one morning he registered a strange, rhythmic vibration occurring deep within his stone. Tap, tap, tap. A single stonecutter was at work at his base, utilizing simple iron tools to systematically alter his eternal form, removing pieces of his mass to build the world. The mountain realized with a shock of profound recognition that the humble stonecutter was mightier than the mountain itself. In that exact moment, the cosmic circle revealed its ultimate meaning, and he was restored to his original reality, hammer in hand, standing quietly before the face of the stone. Nothing in the external world had altered except his internal capacity to see. The work was the same, but now he experienced its steady rhythm as a deep form of moving meditation. He had sought power in external positions, but real power was revealed to be located exclusively in alignment in being completely who you are, precisely where you are situated on the earth. Contentment is the greatest wealth available to human consciousness, stopping the exhausting chase for satisfaction in someone else's life. You are complete in your own being tonight. The raked sand of the mind. We are almost to the threshold of our destination now. This narrative is concerned with the sacred repetition that constructs a meaningful life, the absolute patience that generates beauty, and the daily practice that transforms an ordinary chore into a profound prayer. In an ancient cultural capital, there is a dry garden that has been maintained with an absolute devotion for over 5 centuries. It contains no vibrant flowers. It is a composition constructed entirely of 15 carefully selected rocks and fine white sand, raked daily in precise patterns that suggest the movement of ocean waves. For the past 50 years, this pristine space has been under the direct care of an elderly guide named Master Tu. Every morning, long before the first city activates its noise, Tu enters the garden with his wooden rake. He moves with the effortless, weightless grace of someone who has found their natural rhythm, tracing concentric circles around the 15 larger rocks and drawing parallel lines across the open spaces. By the hour when the sun crests the temple roof, the garden is complete, a flawless, unmoving meditation. But by the hour of afternoon, the wind will have scattered the crisp edges of the lines, or a sudden rainstorm might erase whole sections of his labor. By tomorrow morning, much of today's work will need to be executed entirely again from the beginning. When a young practitioner questioned if this repetition caused him frustration, Tu smiled, explaining that the garden is not the final patterns in the sand. The garden is the act of raking. If the lines remain permanent forever, there would be no space for practice. The wind is a teacher reminding us that beauty is not a possession, but a continuous practice. Do you understand the immense depth of this insight? We inhabit a modern culture, completely obsessed with permanent, static results. We want to achieve peace and have it remain unfluctuating forever. But life is never a linear problem you can solve and finish. It is a garden that must be continuously, patiently tended. Think of your own daily repetitions: making the bed, washing the dishes, caring for your body. The repetition is never futile, it is entirely sacred, a continuous opportunity to bring order and care into the ordinary infrastructure of your day. Master Tu has been raking the same sand for 50 years, yet each stroke remains completely fresh, because he is creating today's pattern, not repeating yesterday's. He reminds us that everything profound is hidden within what appears ordinary, and that the sacred is simply the everyday met with reverence. A visiting businessman once stopped to watch him, asking how he could endure the same routine every day without wanting to leave a permanent mark. Tu replied that every morning he leaves his mark, and every morning the universe erases it, teaching him that beauty doesn't need to last to be real, and that a moment of perfect attention is accomplishment enough. The businessman returned to his career transformed, realizing his companies were just patterns in the sand, learning to find a daily practice of tending without owning. Your life is your garden, and your attention is your rake. The patterns you make today will be gone. Tomorrow make them anyway with your whole heart. The flower sermon. Here we are at the absolute conclusion of our journey and ending that is simultaneously an entirely fresh beginning. All the narratives we have shared in this darkness have been leading your awareness to this exact moment, a quiet recognition, a soft coming home to a truth you have always held within your core. Near the absolute conclusion of his long life on this earth, the great teacher was asked to deliver one final definitive sermon. Thousands of individuals gathered on Vulture Peak, traveling from distant lands, waiting with intense expectation for the ultimate secret of existence to be unveiled. The air hummed with an intense spiritual expectation. The teacher sat quietly in his familiar posture, his spine straight but entirely free from rigidity, looking out at the vast sea of human faces with an absolute, infinite compassion. These people who still believed that wisdom was a commodity located outside themselves. Minutes dissolved into a deep silence. Then, without a word of introduction, he reached beside his cushion and lifted a single lotus flower into the air, turning it slowly between his fingers so that everyone could see its form. And then, absolute nothing. He uttered no words, he simply held the flower up in the quiet air. The crowd waited with bated breath, their mental wheels turning into overdrive, frantically trying to decode the hidden metaphysical meaning of the gesture. But one individual in that vast assembly understood the moment completely, an unpretentious practitioner named Mahakasyapa, who looked at the white flower, then directed his gaze toward the teacher's eyes, and a soft, beautiful smile bloomed across his face. It was the quiet smile of absolute recognition. The teacher saw that smile manifest in the crowd, and his own face instantly lit up in response, declaring that he entrusted the true, wordless eye of the teaching to Mahakasyapa, because the transmission could never be bound by letters or doctrines. Mahakasyapa saw that the flower was not a symbol of the teaching. It was the teaching itself, complete, perfect, temporary, and entirely alive in the present moment. The flower was perfect as it was, entirely present in the now, making no effort to be anything other than itself. But even more profoundly, Mahakasyapa recognized that his own essential awareness was entirely identical to the nature of that flower. There was absolutely no separation between the observer and the observed. This is why he smiled, not because he learned something new, but because he recognized something ancient. You are this flower right now, as you lie there listening. Not tomorrow when you have resolved your anxieties, but right now, exactly as you are complete and flawless in your apparent incompleteness. All these stories tonight, the still pool, the bending bamboo, the empty vessel, they have been whispering the exact same core truth to your consciousness. You are already what you are seeking. The profound calm you are hunting for is the very awareness that is looking through your eyes. The flower in the Buddha's hand has traveled through centuries to bloom in this moment within you. Every practice ever developed was designed to help you stop practicing and just be. You don't need to work at being present. You are presence, you are peace. Welcome home. The long journey that began with the weight of anxiety has returned your awareness to the space of absolute recognition. The frantic internal seeking that started with restlessness has dissolved completely into pure being. The impossible questions that drove your mind to spin have been answered not with conceptual definitions, but with an absolute presence. You came looking for peace and discovered you are peace. Sleep can come now if it wishes to visit, or you can simply float comfortably within this warm, peaceful darkness. You have absolutely nothing to achieve tonight, nothing to become, and nothing to solve. Just exist, be the flower, be the one who sees the flower, be the space in which it all happens. Tomorrow you will wake up and step back into the world of form, responsibilities, and human activity. There will inevitably be challenges and gales, but something fundamental will be different within your system. You will remember, even if only as a quiet feeling within your cells, that you are the flower, and that peace is never somewhere else. Go now into your rest, carrying nothing, needing nothing, being everything. Sleep well, dear friend. You are loved, you are safe, and you are entirely enough.